Welcome to the LBF Church Podcast, where we talk about topics that help us grow in our affections towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him and how he's calling us to live out the gospel in this world. I'm Dan Franklin, and before we get to the topic that I'm going to go through, I wanted to do a book recommendation, which I do from time to time because I believe reading is great and helps us. And the book that I want to recommend is called The Unfolding Mystery by Ed Clowney. And there's a specific reason why I wanted to recommend this, and that's because a lot of times I'll get asked questions about the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and people will say it seems like in the Old Testament God is angry, or that Jesus in the New Testament is bringing a correction to the Old Testament, and this is just not the case. That there's absolute continuity between this. Jesus comes to fulfill, not to replace what was going on in the Old Testament. In fact, the subtitle to this book is Discovering Christ in the Old Testament. It's a powerful book. It's not a difficult read if you're nervous saying, is this going to be deep theology? It is deep and profound, but at the same time, very readable. So Ed Clowney, The Unfolding Mystery, pick it up. You'll be glad that you did, and you'll find it to be very enriching and also equipping in your life. But the topic that I want to talk about today is actually one that's pretty heavy and pretty timely with things that have been going on in the news lately. And that's around the whole subject of all the sexual harassment and sexual assault scandals that have been happening in the political world and kind of the news media world, and then especially in Hollywood with what seems like a new story coming out every 15 minutes about somebody else who is accused of doing something wildly inappropriate. And I guess the way that I'm framing this is just trying to give a Christian response to all of this, which on the one hand, you might think, well, the Christian response is really obvious. This is bad and people shouldn't do it. And that's correct. But I want to give the bigger question to say, how did we end up in a culture where it seems like it's so fostered, where it is fostered an environment where this is happening at such a huge scale and to such prominent people? And on the one hand, I think we need to be careful and just say, all right, this has always gone on. Sadly, this has always been a part of how fallen human beings have interacted. Fallen men have consistently interacted in inappropriate and sometimes dominating ways with women. So in some ways, this is nothing new. And at the same time, I think that there's something instructive about us pulling back and saying, how did we end up in a culture that fostered this? And what does that say about what we can do as individuals to look to be countercultural so that we're not sucked into the same mistakes and sins and evils? And at the same time, also to say, what is our message? What is our Christian message to the culture in light of this? And so what I want to say is I think that the uniqueness of the situation in our culture is that our popular culture, and especially this is true of Hollywood, has tried to hold two things that seem, tried to draw a distinct line between two things. And on the one hand, to say it is good and fine to have loose sexual morals, to be very casual about sex, to sleep around, to have one-night stands, all that is fine, all that is good, we'll approve. In fact, if you think that that's not okay, you're kind of a prude and you just need to get over yourself. So on the one hand, we have that, and on the other hand, that we see it as wildly inappropriate for there to be sexual harassment or sexual assault. Now, there are probably some cultures in which, neither would be okay. In some cultures in which both would be okay. There would just kind of be the expectation that if you have these loose morals over here, then that's sort of going to foster this over here. But in our culture, we've said, no, loose morals, all that is okay. But this over here, you've clearly crossed a line. And while I think most Americans, as we're watching this, not just Christians, but most Americans look at it and say, well, yeah, we do believe that this stuff over here is inappropriate, but it seems like there's not a clear line here. And so as Christians, we can look at that and say that we actually have, the luxury. We actually have the message that, well, yeah, that it's not so much that there's a clear line here, it's that there's a clear line about all of these different things. We are seen sometimes as being sort of prudish or archaic because we believe that sex is just for marriage. And this is not a misreading of the Old Testament and the New Testament. This is the clear reading of the Old Testament and the New Testament, the message of Jesus, the message of the apostles. The Apostle Paul saying, flee sexual immorality. Fornication is just any sex outside of marriage, and that's consistently condemned and spoken against. So we do have a clear message on this. And our clear message is, well, it's all wrong. It's not to say that it's all equally wrong or that there's no distinction between just sort of promiscuous sex and coerced sex or rape. Yeah, there is a difference. But we come to it saying, all right, well, there is a connection here. And I do think that the overall environment of loose sexual morals does foster an environment where people are doing other wrong things that may cross lines, and sometimes they might not be making the clear distinction because there's a parallel going back and forth between these. And again, this is not to excuse any of this behavior. In fact, if you read Scripture, it wouldn't excuse any of the behavior on either side. There's an odd passage in Genesis 34. And actually, it's a passage that I rarely bring up because it's hard to talk about unless you're willing to give it a little bit of time, because it's disturbing to us. Partly because of the content, because in Genesis 34, Jacob's daughter Dinah goes out into the city of Shechem, and I pause to explain it because something happens there. She's either raped or seduced, or it's somewhere in between. And in some ways, you could look at that and say, how is it possible that we could read a story about this happening and have the biblical author not be absolutely clear on whether she was seduced or whether she was raped? And I think it's actually powerful that there's not a clear distinction, that scholars still debate what exactly happened here. Because on the one hand, it seems like it's treated as if the man who did this was wrong and what he did was something very evil. And at the same time, there's some other things where it says that he loved her and he spoke to Dinah kindly and tenderly, and that in the aftermath, he wants to marry her to sort of make things right. So it's an odd passage. And again, we could look at this and say, hey, it's pretty important to figure out whether he just seduced her or whether he raped her. But to Dinah's brothers, that doesn't seem like the most important thing, because either way, they would look at this and say, he wronged her, he defrauded her. And when you get to the Mosaic Law, you have basically that same idea, that it's not that the rape wouldn't be worse, it's just that both are wrong. And I think in our culture where we said, no, this totally fine, you better not say this is not okay, but this over here horribly wrong. It puts us in a position where we end up confused on this whole thing. Whereas the biblical message is, you know what? If you're a man and you seduce a woman who's not your wife, then you have wronged her. You have defrauded her. You have taken something from her that doesn't belong to you. Either way, it's wrong. One may be more wrong than the other, and I would say one certainly is more wrong than the other, but both are wrong. And so our message to the culture is in part to say, part of the reason why we got here to where this could be so fostered is because we've said, let's treat sex as something that's casual. I remember, and this wasn't a Hollywood story, but some of you will remember several years ago, there was a scandal about this Duke lacrosse team. And it ended up being this odd case where a bunch of members of the Duke lacrosse team were accused of raping a woman who was a stripper that they hired. And as things came out more, it turned out that it was a completely fraudulent story. They were declared not only not guilty, but actually innocent, that this was a charge that had no foundation. And I remember in the aftermath, I think it was the district attorney who came out and said, these boys did nothing wrong. And I just remember hearing that and thinking, well, they did nothing wrong. They threw a party with a whole bunch of alcohol and they hired a stripper. I think that's wrong. Now, I understand our culture, all right, they did nothing illegal in our culture, but for us to say, hey, a bunch of guys drinking beer and having a stripper at a party, nothing wrong with that. But over here, if it got a little physical, then all of a sudden it's completely wrong. We're actually clear if we say, well, both of these are completely wrong. One is more wrong than the other, but both are completely wrong. Now taking that in, what I want to do is I want to give a couple of thoughts on how I think that we as Christians can respond to this and take in and use this as a teachable moment. And so I have two main messages that I think that we should take from this whole idea of the explosion of all the sexual assault and sexual harassment allegations. Two things that we should take from it. The first is don't be ashamed. And the second is keep it private. And so these might in some ways sound contradictory, so I'll walk through it. So the first thing I want to say is don't be ashamed. And what I mean by that is I think this actually demonstrates that we as Christians have nothing to be embarrassed about when we talk about the Bible's message to us about saving sex for marriage. I think the rampant sexual abuse and the rampant sexual harassment actually points towards the idea that God is wise in pointing us to save sex for marriage. There's even the idea, and I'll get around to this, but there's a question that always comes up in these issues Anytime somebody tries to say, well, the woman should have done things differently, or the woman put herself in a position for this to happen. And that's called victim shaming, and that, that's just wrong. It doesn't excuse the behavior. And it's true, it doesn't excuse the behavior, but I would just say, kind of taking a roundabout view, if I was talking to a man and the man was saying, all right, well, here's the deal. Like, I don't even know now. Like sometimes a man could seduce a woman and they could have a one-night stand, and then later on she could come back and say, well, no, like you coerced me, or I didn't really want to do that. And I was confused because I thought she was just playing hard to get. And how can you really tell the signals? And my message would be, all right, I got a real easy way for how you avoid any trouble in that area. You only have sex with your wife. You avoid every single thing that you could fall into in that area because you're protecting yourself. You're saving sex for marriage. In a similar way, now I have sons, so that'd be my message to my sons. All right, here's the deal. If you're really that deeply concerned that you're going to end up in a sticky situation because of all of this, that's all the more reason to see God's wisdom on this, on saving sex for marriage. And I think there is a similar message if you have daughters, to say, all right, God is wise in this. So if you end up in a situation where you don't want to have sex that you end up regretting, save sex for marriage. That doesn't excuse what somebody else does. That doesn't excuse bad behavior on someone else. But it does make us all say, God is smart on this. You don't have to be embarrassed about this. If you're a parent, you don't need to be ashamed that you're telling your kids to wait until marriage for sex. There's nothing to be ashamed of that. For us to look at our world and say, well, they've kind of got it right with sex, and we're kind of embarrassed about our message, they don't have it right. If anything is a demonstration that they don't have it right and their way isn't working, it's this. It's not working. We have the God-given message. We don't need to be embarrassed about it. If you're single, or if you're a teenager and I'm kind of embarrassed because I'm a virgin and I'm supposed to stay a virgin, don't be embarrassed about that. There's nothing for you to be embarrassed about. You are following the wisdom of the living God, and he is much smarter than the people creating a culture that fostered sexual harassment and sexual assault in the popular media. There's nothing to be ashamed of. So on the one hand, don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed to talk to your kids about it. Don't be ashamed to live this out. Don't be ashamed to proclaim to the world that this is our message on this issue. So first of all, don't be ashamed. But secondly, I want to say keep it private. And what I mean is, just because your sexuality is private doesn't mean that it's something that you're ashamed of. It just means that there are certain things that are private. And so this applies not only to the whole idea of, all right, saving sex for marriage, it applies to the way that we talk about it. I think there's a sense, and I think in some ways, even the Christian church is falling into this sense that, well, we need to show that we're not ashamed to talk about sex. We need to show that we're not a bunch of prudes, and so we can loosen up and we can have conversations about sex. And what I'd say is, I think parents need to be willing to have conversations about sex with their kids. People probably need to be willing to have frank conversations about sex with a couple close friends in their lives, and husbands and wives need to be willing to talk about this. And certainly as the church, we can talk broadly about what the message of Scripture is on this. But I don't think this is an issue where we all need to just loosen up. Our sexuality is something that's private. And just because something's private doesn't mean that it's something that we're ashamed of. It doesn't mean that we're being prudes. In fact, if you go to a museum and you see all the art on the walls, if you go to a museum, they have people staged around the rooms to make sure that nobody touches the art and nobody messes with the art. And the reason they do this is not because they're ashamed of all the art that they're putting on display. For heaven's sake, they're putting it on display. They're not ashamed of the art, but they're looking to take care of it because the art is precious. And so they would say, yeah, you're not qualified. No, don't touch that. Don't move that. We have other people that treat that with care, that put on gloves. That we treat this very carefully. And with our sexuality, that's something that the parallel is true. It's not that we're ashamed of the fact that we have sexuality. It's the idea that this isn't something that's for public consumption. This isn't something that we're meant to be out there about all the time, just talking about publicly. In a way, when Solomon talks to his son about this, he's talking most specifically about just sexual intercourse, but I think it's applicable more broadly just to how we approach this. When in Proverbs chapter 5, Solomon says to his sons in not so subtle euphemistic language, should your springs overflow in the streets, your streams of water in the public squares? And the context of all this is that he's saying, you know what? Sex is for your wife. Your sex life is for you and your wife. Why should you be spilling all over the place? Nobody else gets in on this. That this is for you and this is for her. It's not for anyone else. I think even the way that we talk about sex, you know what? We don't need to, in order to show that we're authentic, to be cracking jokes or be talking openly about our sex lives, even within marriage. You know, that's not something that's for public consumption. It's appropriate to keep it private. And part of why I say this is because there's a sense with the sexual harassment things of saying, well, if I crack a joke, did that cross a line? If I make kind of a comment, did that cross the line? And just to say, you know, this isn't really a subject that's for big personal consumption. It's something that we're meant to have conversations about that are helpful. Certainly there's joking that goes along in a marriage, and this is not something to be ashamed of, but this is also not something that we need to have everybody in on. Just because you're keeping it private doesn't mean that you're ashamed of it. It just means that you're trying to treat something that's precious and very important as if it's precious and very important. As we approach this, we don't need to be ashamed of the message that God has given us on this. It's a good message. It's a right message. It's a message that keeps us from all kinds of pitfalls and all kinds of even legal trouble. It's a message that's good and that is for our good. And you're not being a prude if you decide that you're not going to be having lots of conversations or you're not going to be sharing your body with a whole bunch of other people. You're treating a precious gift that God has given you as a precious gift. Just because you're keeping it private doesn't mean that you're ashamed of it. Now, this, as I've talked about this, obviously, this is a heavy topic. There might even be some things I said here that hit some hot buttons, and I understand that that's the case because this is a hot button topic right now. So if it did, and if you want to have further conversation about it, you can feel free to leave a comment just on this specific episode of the podcast. Some of you are watching this. The way that you can watch this is on our website, lbf.church, just by clicking on blog and podcast, and then you can come to the video and you can also read the article that goes along with it. Leave a comment or leave a question or leave feedback, and in a future episode, I may refer back to those things. And if there's something that I need to bring clarification or help on, I'd be happy to do that. But you can also download all the episodes of the LBF Church Podcast on iTunes. Just go there and search for LBF Church Podcast. Please do leave a review or leave a rating, because our goal is just to get good content out to more people so that more people can be equipped and can grow in their affections towards Jesus. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen to this. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church Podcast.